is it important to pass the faith along from generation to generation? Timothy's mother and grandmother created a culture and heritage of faith from which Paul encouraged Timothy to draw strength and courage. The theme of the importance of family continued throughout this text. Paul shows Timothy the love and affection that a father shows a son. Paul also reminds Timothy of the faith that his mother and grandmother possessed and expresses the belief that Timothy also possessed that same faith. Throughout the passage, Paul shows Timothy how to use that faith to reach the nations with the gospel, which brings us to our key verse for today, which reads, I remember your genuine faith, for you share the faith that first filled your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and I know that same faith continues strong in you. 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 5. Paul remembered the sincere faith that was a part of Timothy's lineage through his mother and grandmother. Paul also used the word persuaded, which is peitho in Greek, and translated as convinced. Paul is also convinced that the unfeigned faith in Lois and Eunice was in Timothy. Paul told Timothy to ignite the spiritual endowment that God had already placed in Timothy. Paul says that the gift of God had been placed in Timothy by his laying hands on Timothy. Timothy had a history of having the gift with his mother and grandmother in his family. In verses 5 and 6, Paul encourages Timothy to look at his family heritage and see how God had worked through the faith of Timothy's mother and grandmother. Timothy was to use the knowledge of their faith to help him stir up the gift of God inside him. Paul contrasts what God has not given us, spirit of fear, with that which he has given us, power, love, and a sound mind. The word for spirit is pneuma. One of the translations of pneuma is breath. This suggests that God never breathed into us or gave us fear, which in Greek is dialia and means timidity. Verse 7 tells us that God did give us power, love, and a sound mind. The Greek word for power is dunamis, which means miraculous power. The word love in this verse comes from the Greek word agape and means godly love or affection. And finally, the word for sound mind is Greek sophronismos, which means discipline or self-control. God has given us the ability to have miraculous power, godly love, and self-control. Since God has not given us the spirit of fear, we should not be ashamed of the Lord's testimony, which includes the suffering and crucifixion of Jesus. Paul reminds Timothy that God delivered and invited them to do a sacred work. Paul also reminds Timothy that the calling was not due to their works, but because of Christ's purpose and grace given to them from the beginning. Paul and Timothy had been purposed to be speakers of divine truth, ambassadors who spread the gospel worldwide, and instructors of the word. He reminds Timothy that he is suffering, but he is in no way ashamed. Paul knew what he believed and was willing to suffer for it. As a matter of fact, when Paul used the word persuaded, he used the Greek word peitho, which means convinced. This is the same word he used in verse 5 when he said that he was convinced that the unfeigned faith in Lois and Eunice was also in Timothy. So here's our lesson. The children of Israel would find strength and encouragement as they read about the battles and struggles of their forefathers. In Jewish culture, the prevailing attitude was, if it happened to my forefathers, it happened to me. A great sense of strength and pride comes from knowing one's ancestors. Think about what things you can learn, we can learn from them. And let's ask ourselves about the legacy we are leaving for the next generation. Thank you so much for listening and subscribing to iLights. Heavenly Father, fill our hearts with what we truly desire, for who we truly seek is you.